Alexander, welcome. Welcome to the family that's coming in to watch this production. This is NK Production. I'm your host, AI, Abe Ilo, lovely known as AI Judah, with the Lighthouse Ministry. And we'd like to give our guests an opportunity to introduce himself and, kind of get into a discussion about Ethiopia.
With a couple of specific questions in mind that I know you're interested in. Thank you very much, Abi, for having me on this show. I'm very honored to be around with the family, the Lighthouse Production. Now that we have made contact, I've been following your work a bit. So I'm talking from Geneva, Switzerland at the moment. It's about 7 o'clock at night. Lovely Thursday evening here in the Alps. I am in Switzerland at the moment, but I do work at UCL in London, University College London. I'm with the history department. I have been working on slavery in Ethiopia for quite a while now, starting with my PhD, which I finished in 2016. I've been sort of in touch with the question of slavery and sort of intergenerational existence of post-slavery. If you want, we can discuss all this. I did my PhD studying, working with small minority groups at the Western Ethiopian border with Sudan, the Mao and Komo, who live scattered along the frontier there between Oromia, Benishangul, Gumuz, and Gambela. If you're familiar with the map, basically in our background, I don't know if our viewers see this, the left sort of tip next to your face, outside that stretches in the Sudan. This is this area where I've been working, and to a large degree, I would say. Respondents and interviewees and participants of my study and my research and people I've been living with and who hosted me during this time and shared their past and also their memories with me kind of kept going back to this idea of that there was slavery in this area and that they were sort of squeezed and pushed by slave raids into the Ethiopian lowland that is sort of going lower to the Nile Valley. And taking account of this sort of oral traditions and oral data, I started to become more interested in the general topic of history. And I am now with a project at UCL, as I said, which studies abolition, African approaches to abolition. Usually there is a tendency to see abolition through Western eyes, like we see many things through Western eyes. When it comes to Africa, this sort of Eurocentric gaze, it needed the Europeans to abolish something that they themselves had originally sort of brought upon Africa. One perspective, of course, there are other perspectives that also include the existence of forms of slavery within African societies. And sort of this sort of in between, what were the African sort of ideologues, politicians, spokespeople, religious leaders, and so forth? How did they sort of enforce abolition, or how did they negotiate abolition? What's the African sort of view on abolition? And I do work on Ethiopia again. In this case, I work with the Institute for Ethiopian Studies. We have been doing quite some work with the team there. And it's becoming very clear that this is a super fruitful perspective because beyond sort of the humanitarian interventionist perspective of the British and the very fascist propagandist views of the Italians, is to actually focus on what did Ethiopians think, Ethiopian intellectuals, Ethiopian politicians, and writers about slavery at that point, and sort of where is this European narrative ending and where does the Ethiopian story begin, and how slavery became abolished eventually.
Yeah.
So this is roughly what I'm doing.
So, and in saying that, our audience is pretty intelligent, so I'm sure it won't be lost on them that you are European, right? And so for this to be your specialty, you have a PhD, and for you to have been in these parts of the world, did you have some personal like is the idea of slavery in any way attached to your experience through your bloodline and family, or was this just something that you kind of like stumbled upon and found an interest in it, and it took you deeper and deeper into it? Like, what's your connection to the subject?
Yeah, you see this. I mean, so I think I've always operated on this premise that it would be good if we all had sort of an understanding of historical sort of situation. I come from Germany, European German, so we deal with the history, and my generation, not particularly, but amongst any other generation that has gone through it, we sort of work through the commemoration and the memory of the Holocaust, for example,
Right.
The Second World War. And I think I don't want to draw lines at this point, but what I want to say is that this sort of helping understand or working towards a public discourse of this kind of complicated histories, that is something I think that may have driven me now to kind of, I realize that Ethiopia, you called it I don't know if this is now visible or if the program is called that, what did you call it? The unspoken truths about the untold history of slavery in Ethiopia. And I think this is a bit where this whole program that we're now running with Addis Ababa University is coming from, to kind of focus on this and bring different perspectives about an uncomfortable past to the table. But I have no direct relations to slavery. And as I explained earlier, it was really for me a point that surprised me. I mean, 2012, a colleague of mine was running a discussion forum at Addis Ababa University with monthly lectures on labor and slavery in Ethiopian history. So that was one of the very first notions of slavery that sort of tried to bundle this whole complex and sort of bring new perspectives into it. And I started then sharing my very initial thoughts in 2012. There was also the Diradawa in Eastern Ethiopia, the International Conference for Ethiopian Studies. I would think this was the first collective attempt to study the history of slavery and slave-like phenomena in Ethiopian studies. Before that, you have Abdus Samed Ahmed, you have Pankhurst, you have sort of the 90s are a bit dotted. Fernihu, a couple of studies here and there, but they're sort of very individualistic, very separated. They didn't talk to each other. And I think over the past 10 years or so, we've really managed to bring a bit more sort of collective interest onto the topic. Yeah,
and there definitely is a sort of awakening that's happening, I guess, globally, where the concept of colonialism, neocolonialism, the effects of it, how widespread it is, and how much of that effect are we actually aware of? Because in the West, for one, being of the diaspora, they try to direct a lot of us to Northwest Africa, You know, the idea is that most African Americans probably come from somewhere in Northwest Africa. And so the idea of slavery in Ethiopia to a lot of us is somewhat foreign. And even the idea of slavery taking place on the continent where Africans are enslaved by other, not just being captured and traded into slavery, but actually slaves on the continent is pretty kind of a new concept. So my question to you is, what comes to mind when you hear the phrase untold slavery in Ethiopia?
Well, yeah, the topic is really well chosen, I think. But the question I had when I saw the idea of the format first was, at what point in time is it untold? Because to be very honest, between the 1920s and 1930s, you literally get the idea or the sense that Europeans had nothing else to talk about but about slavery in Ethiopia. You know, it is, and that sort of humanitarian discourse of the League of Nations, of the anti-slavery societies, and those organizations that kind of propose this massive humanitarian crisis in Ethiopia. Well, yes, they come with their liberal sort of humanitarian thinking, but the narratives that they spin are literally one-to-one leading into the weaponized propaganda of the Italians on slavery. So again, from the 1920s to the 1940s, basically Ethiopia is known for little else but slavery in the world. So it's really it's
world though. That's one of the mechanisms of colonialism, is a lot of the conversations that happen don't include the African. You know, so whereas it might be a huge conversation in the European circles, all the more why we know nothing about it. You know what I mean? It's like the real conversations that happen were systematically kept, you know, we were kept out of those conversations.
Of course, I mean, and we are now in this project that we're looking at this time. We are really sort of trying to see the counter narrative, and you can very clearly see from the archives that the idea of Ethiopia being an independent country, sovereign and ready to deal with slavery by itself, is really the position of the Ethiopians. But none of the European powers go as far. I mean, there's sometimes here and there, like Noel Buxton, who leads the mission of the Anti-Slavery Society to Ethiopia, on the invitation of Haile Selassie, by the way, sort of has this, Haile Selassie is the right person to do it, but he doesn't have the capabilities. We should help him. We should be there. He doesn't, okay, I'm paraphrasing now. He doesn't really know what he's doing, you know, he needs advisors, he needs to, and it's all sort of in this power spectrum of paternalistic setting of, wow, okay, so there's a sovereign African state, somehow got admitted to the League of Nations, so we should sort of talk on eye heights, but slavery really becomes an almost ideal place to sort of spin a paternalistic, we have to help Ethiopia to get rid of the evils of slavery narrative, right? So you're absolutely right. It's while Ethiopia is always a very special case in Africa because of its perceived non-colonial history, you see the same kind of patterns at work. I mean, there's always this, but if we would do it, it would be better. Well, there's not really there's no evidence that the Europeans would do it better, right? So we are comparing policies, we are comparing the court system, we are comparing the legal texts, we compare them to other sort of colonial contexts. And to be very honest, I mean, as Haile Selassie said, and also Ethiopian historiography, like for example, Kebede Mikael in his book of the 1930s, Ethiopia and Western Civilization, they're very clear. Or Asfa Yilma, who writes a history of Ethiopia, she's a niece of Haile Selassie. There you find this perspective of, but we did exactly what was expected from us. So we don't know why we were let down at a
Right.
point where all we did was to try to get this problem, under control, in a sense. Haile Selassie, and
Correct.
this is absolutely true, never said, no, we don't have slavery, we don't, that's not true. There were negotiations which only come to fore if you really look through the archives, in search of the Ethiopian voices, in a sense. And that's why I'm so
Right.
grateful to be working with the Institute for Ethiopian Studies, because that's really where we find a lot of documents outside of the general corpus of course, the colonial archives at Bodleian and Oxford and so forth.
So from your research also, would you say that there is a disconnect in the definition of what slavery actually looked like in terms of an internal problem versus when it left outside of Africa and became a institution, say, in America and other places? Because if you have, say, for instance, like some people might really have a problem with a 9-to-5 schedule, because it takes you out of the house for so long, and but it's the structure. So it's not really a humanitarian issue. It's just the way that it is. So is it possible that this idea of slavery in Africa wasn't the same as it is in other places? And therefore it wasn't until Halati joined the League of Nations that it became this humanitarian issue that could be championed, so that those championing it could get access to, say, other things. Like, we're going to use this as the ploy to come in and help and be big brother, but really it's not a humanitarian issue. It's just the narrative is being spun that way so that we have access to more land, more resources, more people. Like, could that be part of the situation as well?
Yeah. No, this is you're pointing in an excellent direction. I mean, this is really important. The way slavery was narrated is intriguing. Like, if you go back to the 1840s, for example, some of the first missions to Ethiopia, Ethiopia at that point is not the empire that it becomes later on. It is more or less a conglomerate of kingdoms in the Ethiopian highlands, Semitic speaking, sort of stretch between Showa and Tigray, if you want. And then, so the first missions, they enter the courts of certain rulers, usually. And one's very prominent is Haile Selassie, the grandfather of Menelik, later Menelik. And he is sort of the king of Showa at the time. His court is in Ankober, and as William Cornwallis Harris is bound to write a treaty of friendship and commerce with Haile Selassie. It's about getting access to the hinterland, having sort of set foot gradually at the Aden coast, opposite on the Red Sea side, and then slowly sort of getting the head around. And they are very, the mission, the Cornwallis mission, if you want, is very fascinated with slavery and how it exists. And there's one, and from there, I think, as far as I can trace, is originate this idea of benign slavery. So Cornwallis says very clearly in 1840 in his book, this is not the horrors of the Caribbean or American slavery that we know. This is sort of serfdom. Slaves are held, in the proximity of the family. That the labor is not hard. It doesn't have this industrial violence to it. Now, of course, when you look into the scholarly,
just to inject at that particular point, the slaves also probably were not. They probably didn't lose their name or access to their history or their religious beliefs or their because these are all other elements of Western slavery that makes it so atrocious, is that you lose everything. You basically get stripped to bare bones. So just to kind of point out, was that also not part of slavery in Africa?
Yeah. So this is exactly, you're on spot. This is exactly where I wanted to go to. The problem is, we do have to acknowledge that slavery may not be as benign as it's been narrated from those first sources, and this is also how the Ethiopians portray slavery. So the Ethiopian texts on slavery are very much built in the legislation of the Feta Nagas, the law of kings, which is an ancient law code that then later informs all sorts of legal aspects in modern Ethiopia, but also the laws of manumission and slavery. So while the well-being is sort of a requirement for any slaveholder, that's on paper, that's the Feta Nagas speaking, right?
Okay.
It's very tricky to then say, oh, but this is all then evidence that slaves were just living happily with the family, because there's always social, but these are now two different sort of streams that have to come together. The one is the historical perception, and the other one is a very modern post-slavery dialogue and discourse that we also have to have, because for many people who suffer from this stigma of slave descent, that really runs their life story of marginalization, right? And I'm also not, we had this discussion previously. There's a fantastic paper by Seifu Mutafaria in the Journal of Ethiopian Studies, Sile Yabaria Sim Amara Bahil, about slave naming in the Amara culture. Okay. It's an Amharic paper, but it shows very clearly that this renaming of people has happened. So in order to integrate the slave into the family, he was given a different name. But this is not just an Amara, just because Seifu's paper is focusing on Amara. This is a phenomenon that you find in many other communities, ethnic communities. Also the Oromo have their own integration system. The Beta Israel have their own integration rituals, to bring slaves into the family. Now, this all sounds okay, but it sounds more benign. But I would refrain from saying, freedom lost is freedom lost at any time. And people were not let to go home. I mean, one of the intriguing parts of the legislation of the 1920s, 1923 is, and then a slave is free and he should go home and live where he came from. But now you have to imagine that these are often children, that have already zigzagged through huge territories. And then they grow up in a family, and then they are told, okay, now you can go home. You're like, okay, but where do I go to? So it's not surprising that the Ethiopian historiography emphasizes the aspect of they stayed with their masters in cordial relationships, because there was also no other chance of doing.
That's very much what you have with the African American in many ways, where there's a large population or mindset that we are Americans. We've been here over 400 years. How long do you occupy land before it becomes your indigenous land? Where you clearly have no connection to what your ancestors were connected to 400 years ago. However, I think that the difference is when there's a systematic effort to deny you access to who you were. That's when it becomes nefarious, because it's like, okay, it's one thing to have to take on another name like a marriage, to represent who you're owned by or who you work for or represent. But when when the powers that be actively remove who you were, and you don't even have a means to access that, for some degree of connection to the earth, where your soul connection is to where your slavery began, is where it's very problematic, right? And so I'm sure we could probably go on, but again, I am kind of watching the time. So great points. One of the other things that, when we look back to Ethiopia, talking about history being erased, most Americans, when we think back to Ethiopia, honestly, for a lot of us, it's through Bob Marley that we end up in Ethiopia. It's through his music and his honoring of Haile Selassie, through the cannabis planting those things that we find ourselves, you know, in Ethiopia with Haile Selassie. Prior to that, even when I was young, Ethiopia was advertised and marketed to America and to African Americans as the poorest country in the world. You know, the children in barren fields with flies on them, and you know, it almost became this thing where it was an insult to call an African American Ethiopian or to associate them with Africa, right? So the idea of there being kings and royalty, you know, in modern history connected to Ethiopia, like Menelik and Zatu and these characters, we never heard about this, right? And so now that I have you on the platform to interview, one of the questions that we had was about Tudros or Theodore II, right? This was a guy that many European nations came together and even, you know, galvanized a lot of people in the continent to go against this one individual. There's even been a comparison to Tudros to the movie 300, you know, where you had this small army of people that was like pretty much in a situation where they had to battle a much larger army. But when we think about what and he lost, I mean, maybe you could give us your insight on that. But the question that comes from that is, how come this war isn't much more prevalent in our history, in our conversation about African history? And why wouldn't, with so many different countries being involved, why wouldn't this be viewed more on a global scale as a world war, considering that the artifact, I think it was how many thousands of elephants and donkeys was used to remove the gold and artifacts. Like, these things are still in major museums and collections around the world, generating millions of dollars, but this was never considered to be like a world war or something on the scale of a world war. What would be your, what would be your take on that?
Yeah, well, again, very interesting question. Of course, Theodore sort of is seen as the unifier, the first sort of to end the Zemane Mesafint, this sort of warlord conflict that ravaged the Ethiopian highlands, and he brought sort of these different kingdoms together under his crown. So the history of Theodore circles very much around that. Of course, I think it has a lot to do with what's being remembered. So because Ethiopia is being remembered for the Battle of Adwa in many circles, I think the question of Magdala has sort of lost to that, in our conversation, which is quite curious from an academic standpoint, because there is, apart from, I come to the question of the World War, but what is absolutely clear is that it's the first, and this is not from me, so I'm quoting Volker Mattis here, who wrote a very interesting book on the siege of Magdala. It has been translated into English. You can get it with Wiener publishers, I think. He said it's the first mission, or the first war where you had embedded journalists. Like, you have so many writers and sort of, travel writers, explorers, researchers in that entourage, and Stanley being one of them, writing for one of the newspapers in London. That same Stanley, right? Yeah. In his career there, he's one of the journalists. You have Austrians, you have French, you have the British. And at a time, and this is why I say it's a question of the historical standpoint, or where you are in history, in a sense, and what else is sort of your fixation or your point to think about certain things. This imagination of the colonial war for the first time going against an Ethiopian emperor in a pontifical mission to show the savage lord who the Queen of England is, and not to show him not to gamble, diplomatically, which is outrageous at that time. I mean, it's a misunderstanding. I don't. Yeah. Okay. I mean, yes, there were the. It's hard to sort of discuss the hostages away, but apart from that, in what I wanted to say in this colonial narrative, you have Rudyard Kipling's Jungle Book, the original. When you read Tembo of the Elephants,
Yeah.
the old elephant is actually narrating about the campaign of Magdala and how he carried, how he was brought from India and carried the huge gun and other stuff on his back up.
Are you talking about Are you talking about Disney's Jungle Book?
No. Yes, Disney has done the Jungle Book, but it's just a very small portion of the Jungle Book. The original Jungle Book by Kipling is a collection, an anthology of fables where basically animals talk about stuff and the animal kingdom, basically. You know, and there's one story that is Tempo of the Elephants. that one of the elephants was actually in Ethiopia. This is just to say that there, at a certain point, I think this really captured the hearts and minds of the European public. Again, like you were saying in the beginning, you know, stories are being made. They're not a historical study that we remember is there because somebody takes the effort to actually keep it, you know, give it weight or worth or whatever. So I think there you have a bit of this, why is it so overshadowed in a sense? Well, it's returning to be enormously important because of all the artifacts being stolen and the idea of restitution. At the moment, Ethiopia, maybe with the Benin bronzes, is like at the height of the debate of restitution, of returning stolen colonial artifacts to Africa, different African countries. Ethiopia is not alone, but Magdala is coming back to be a very important symbol of colonial plunder. And the word plunder comes from a book, Loot and Plunder. That's the story of Alemayu Tedros, the son of Alemayu, of Theodros, who was taken to Britain with General Speedy, and then very soon died in captivity. He wasn't the only one. In our circles where we discuss anti-slavery now, Warkene Eshete, who is then known as Dr. Charles Martin, who becomes a physician for Menelik coming from India, is also one of the victims of that. He's found in a field, abandoned by the family, or potentially the family being killed, and he's also taken back to Britain. But he doesn't die. He makes a career in the British service, gets to India, becomes a doctor, and then goes to Ethiopia to become one of the prolific statesmen of the Haile Selassie area, including being his advisor at the League of Nations, including being one of his main editors at the Berhane Salam newspaper, one of the big sort of shining intellectual products of the Haile Selassie time, where modernization ideas are being discussed. And Charles Martin Warkene is one of the first to write against slavery. His article Silibarinet about slavery are the first two sort of articles that speak to the intellectual elite, nobility, public. I mean, not everybody reads in Ethiopia at the time, so you have to be careful with who you're writing for when you write a newspaper. But, you know, in this sort of elite society, he's the first to actually write, now let's get rid of it. We have to free our slaves. You know, we should not do that. It's not right.
One of the questions that comes to mind, you mentioned the people that Tewodros had, I guess they were from England, that he had them captive, but they had homes, they had servants, they, you know, according to the Siege of Magdala, the book, you know, they were treated well, based on his relationship through writing with Queen Victoria. And so because of something, I guess, that he was requesting, or some letter that was supposed to get to her, that never got to her, is what actually led to him holding these people captive. right?
Yeah,
So
that's the general narrative, that he, as the emperor of Ethiopia at the time, sort of rides to Victoria, and like everyone um, after him, besides him, is interested in British allegiance because of the expansion of the Ottoman Empire. So
right. So
what he
when you
wants,
speak on
he
that
wants.
though, it's not in reference to him trying to be a part of the League of Nations, or does the League of
No, no,
Nations
no,
even
no.
exist
The League of
at
Nations
that time?
doesn't exist yet. No, no.
Oh,
It's purely domestic politics. I mean, regional, not domestic, regional politics. The expansion of the Ottomans keeps threatening Ethiopian sovereignty, Christian Ethiopian sovereignty. There's constantly skirmishes, and the Ethiopians do not look favorably at the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the Red Sea area.
yeah,
And so Theodros wants weapons support against the Ottomans, and he's being
right,
ignored. And
right, okay,
so, just to very quickly make this point, it's why it's not a world war per definition. I do understand where you're coming from. I mean, it's like they're basically bringing everybody to Ethiopia to crush this, rather small, nascent empire at the time. But a
correct,
world war, I think, per definition, would need an alliance here, a cluster of countries that come together against another cluster of countries, and then you have all the skirmishes across a considerable. It's very localized. It's Britain with its Bombay forces against what they even see as a very sort of provincial lord. I don't think that at that point they really recognize Ethiopia as that empire that Ethiopia is or
well,
becomes or out to become.
but again, when you talk about how you spin a narrative, of course that would be the narrative, is that he was, a small problem or a warlord, but you put
Yeah,
so much energy and resources into it that
good
doesn't
point.
support that narrative.
Yeah,
You know what I
that's a
mean?
good point.
It's pretty counterintuitive. And then also the fact that you said that it's up for debate about restitution, but how can it be up for debate against those that claim to have moral authority? Like if you're using your position of moral authority to go and police other lands, how can it be a question of whether you need to return things that don't belong to you? You know what I
Mm.
mean? Like, why is it a debate
Yeah,
once it's in your hands?
I see your point, but I mean, you also see that there's a bit of a shift, and the debate is gradually encroaching also in the public sphere and the public understanding. It gets more coverage in newspapers, like popular news outlets, and you have debates within those institutions. Some are fruitful, some basically are blocking or sort of trying to protect the status quo of their colonial past, sort of sealing
Yeah.
it off. But I think, I mean, it's a gradual process. It's not like these things, they take time, like you have to see both sides. Of course, you first of all need to start and convince people that there's something that hasn't, that wasn't there in the 50s mainly, or 60s. Yeah, 60s. Okay, that's where it potentially starts to trickle in, but it takes an enormous amount of time to convince a European that the colonial history was actually not as great as they were made to think.
Right.
That's the
Yeah.
problem. That's our problem with our past. That's us Europeans having to come to terms with what we've done to the world, right? And that's not. We talked about uneasy histories or uneasy memories or something like that in the beginning. I think this is also part of that. How do you get people to understand that they're being Eurocentric when they think, yeah, but why would it be better kept in Africa? It's when the British Museum, I'm just naming any museum here,
Yeah.
I don't point fingers, is basically the best place since 1880 to display this stuff.
Well, part of the issue comes down to when and again, being a European is like when you can say, okay, well, if it wasn't for us, would these artifacts even been preserved and taken care of the way that they have? We've done such a great job of keeping this history alive and available for the public, right? And
Yeah, heavy.
so,
It's the question.
like yourself, that is into the facts and history and really getting to the meat of it, would you say that there is a level of, for one, for younger Europeans that don't necessarily support the idea of slavery, they see that it's a crime against humanity or whatever, is there an effort to say wash their hands of the doings of their ancestors when it comes to slavery? And how can you accomplish that and still celebrate what you consider to be the accomplishments? How can you hold on to the quote unquote good parts and negate all of the negative?
Yeah, no, but that's exactly what I'm saying. This is a process that is only just beginning, because in the first place you need to you kind of have to come out of your silo and understand that keeping it in Europe makes it unaccessible for the better part of the world, and mainly for the part where it's come from, because we have immigration laws, and we have a whole industry of embassies and visa sections that basically are trained to keep people away from coming and seeing this kind of stuff, right?
Right.
But what I wanted to say is it's a gradual process, and and I completely agree on the broader line that you're framing. I think with university programs, with digitization programs, that may not be the best of solution, but there starts a process of coming together a bit, closer. Some things are being returned. My colleague, Dr. Takele Mary, the head of the director of the Institute of Ethiopian Studies, they have their own ethnographic museum started in the 60s at Addis Ababa University. He has received several artifacts that came back. Some of them, and that's also part of the truth, donated not by Western missions or embassies, but by actually Ethiopians who bought stuff and gave it back to the country, like rich Ethiopians in the diaspora. So I grant that, but I give you that. Absolutely, it's not a perfect process, but and while you're right, we are nowhere near acknowledging the depth of European guilt in all that. I think in some form these debates are starting. I think that's the best I can say at this point.
Yeah. No worries. It's not for you to answer for all white people. That's not what we're trying to put you on that particular hot seat.
No.
But
no,
so
I mean it gets my. I mean, I'm also part of this debate, right? There was this the Demtau debate recently that also got some coverage in the Guardian, for example. Desta Demtau was a patriot in the Ethiopian army, killed by the Italians, and one of his stars of honor was taken by an Italian family, potentially one of the soldiers who was involved in his killing.
Yeah.
And now there was this massive outrage that the family sold this to what are these called, auction houses, right?
Yeah.
And then there were petitions to the auction house that they cannot sell this, they cannot buy this, and if they buy it, they have to give it back. And these are things that Europeans haven't talked about that much in public.
Right.
So that's what I'm saying. It's a beginning of a process. I don't know where this is leading.
So we probably think about it more than other races do because it directly affects us. But when you think about conversations like this as it relates to Black people, just say in comparison to the reconciliation that's given to the Jewish community when it comes to their experiences, it's almost like it becomes this proverbial gray area when it comes to the Blacks. Like, well, we got to figure it out, but when it comes to non-Black communities, there's always a clear right and wrong, or at least it appears that way. That could just be perception. But one of the things that I wanted to get on to kind of not move away from it, but segue into the next question. You said that Tewodros dealt with the battle of the warlords to kind of unify the crown under, I guess, his one rule, so to speak, or more centralized rule, which, from our understanding, would represent the throne of David versus other kings or warlords that, I guess represented their own whatever that was. You know what I mean? And so when you think of it in terms of that, the throne of David in particular, that Haile Selassie sat on later, there were some war when Zatu was on the throne. There was a war between her husband and Haile Selassie because he wanted to join the League of Nations, and that was not the favorable direction for the throne in Ethiopia at that time. So could you speak to that and to the fact that is there any evidence that Haile Selassie joining the League of Nations was the cause of, say, the collapse of the throne of David or the so-called Solomonic dynasty?
Mhm. Yeah, also a great question. Now, let me just very quickly say this, because I realize that there's a lot of tendency in, if you use certain phrases, and I said warlords, right? Is the Semane Mesafint that Theodros brought together translates better in the era of the princes, the different regional rulers. Warlord, if we use it like that, and I mean, I may have been a bit lax here. I just want to clarify that this should not evoke ideas of, West African warlordism of the 90s or Somalia or something like that, because this is Western framing of local conflicts. So just to go back to that. The story with Haile Selassie, look, I mean, the Solomonic dynasty is, that's a foundational myth. And now Haile Selassie was a power politician in a sense, and there were obstacles to his rule, and there were conservatives, and there were encampments. There were people who wanted this, there were people who wanted that, and it was sort of Haile Selassie's approach was to rally international support, knowing that Italy was on its doorsteps. It was the time of the 1906 tripartite treaty. He knew that he couldn't trust the Europeans, so he needed to I think he started sort of I don't know if this is an English expression, it's like translated from German, the flight in front, to front, like confronting his problem, not, in terms of diplomacy. Yeah. So what he did was, and of course there was the Battle of Sagale with Yasu, and there were these different camps. When there were people, slavery was a big part of the internal debate also. It is reported that many of the Rases, the generals in his army and in his sort of bureaucracy, were very much averse against the idea that somebody would come and say, but if we want to cooperate with the West, we have to give them that. Let's modernize this. We need a better tax system, we need a better economic base. We have to stop, living from hand to mouth in the peripheries. We cannot have our nobility sit around, walk around, and take from the peasants and the slaves. We need to change that. So I sincerely think, with everything that comes with it, and the challenges of it, and the imperfections of it from a historical perspective, he was trying to rally a camp around him and alienate those forces that stood in his way. But to say that the League of Nations had anything to do with the decline of the Solomonic dynasty, I would say no. In fact, what it did, once all this was won and he was crowned Emperor of Ethiopia, he was at the absolute height of his power. While, of course, you can say the dogs were barking and the caravan just moved on. There were so many voices that said, oh God, now this guy, he doesn't have Ethiopia under control. There's slavery everywhere. But he was the emperor of Ethiopia, and he stood there being member of the League of Nations. And maybe that sounds a bit contradictory to what I said earlier, that he was under a lot of pressure. The pressure I don't want to discuss away. but nonetheless, seen from an Ethiopian perspective, he manifested his power, and his power was inscribed in the Solomonic, the founding myth of the Solomonic dynasty. And he was the emperor, Nebuchadnezzar, the king of kings and the Lion of Judah. And what breaks the Solomonic dynasty eventually is not the Italians, because he comes back and reinstates the throne and, even formalizes and centralizes and strengthens this empire more at the expense of all sorts of regional conflicts, marginalizations of the Muslim, Oromo, all this that then leads to the 1960s and the student movement, and eventually to the revolution. And the revolution is what breaks the back of the Solomonic dynasty, I think.
Okay. Thank you for that. And so I guess my only question would be, what is the function of the word myth in that explanation?
That was my question. That's what I was going to say. A small question. That was it right there.
Oh, this is just for me to say. This is for me. This is a political process, and there's an ideology beyond that is used to justify certain things that you're doing as a politician. So for me, this is not. I do not believe in the Solomonic dynasty as the Solomonic dynasty. As the Queen of Sheba and Menelik. I think this is a public myth. This is a national narrative that frames a state in a certain way, and that frames a polity and belonging and nationalism in a certain way, and it is hugely influential then and now. But from an academic sort of detached standpoint, I think it's part of a political program.
Okay, so
I'm not a religious person. So if somebody says I'm going to war for whatever, whichever deity, I would tell them, okay, but that deity is, think about why you're doing this, because potentially you don't know who you're fighting for. To say it like that. You get the point.
We have certain myths in America about the forefathers that make them larger than life, so that when people join the military or when they do patriotic things, they feel like they're supporting this idea. Okay, I got you. So and there's a degree of the myth. Well, let me put it like this. From the word of mouth, you being actually in Ethiopia and talking to the people, do they support the myth, or have they dismissed it? Is it an old myth? Nobody cares. What is the climate or the conversation around the myth of the Solomonic dynasty, or King Solomon and Sheba and Menelik and that whole tale?
Mm-hmm. Well, so it's still being a very important sort of base for the country, also under the new government under Abiy Ahmed, and the finalization of, for example, the Menelik Palace and the opening of the Menelik Palace to the public. There's public display of church paintings, but also modernized to kind of sort of give it to see the historical continuity. So it's not church paintings, but it's church art made modern in some of the exhibition parts that tell the story. This is the national founding legend, or the founding story history, the King Menelik I and the Queen of Sheba. And all this still plays a huge role. Then there are increasingly pan-Ethiopian ideas that go back, I think, to the imperial times and sort of take stock from this idea under Haile Selassie, with this whole, we were a nation, we were someone, we were seen as somebody, as a player in the world. That also has to do with the League of Nations, and being sort of only 5 years under Italian rule and with the help of the British and so forth. I think there are people who relate to that, very strong with the Rasta community of Shashamane and others who live in Ethiopia and become citizens or neutralized in Ethiopia. Is also a hard process for them, but that happens. And these people, they're strong on the this story, this history. I think for many now active in politics, it's far gone. Haile Selassie was also, we do not have to forget that under the last 30 years of the TPLF, Haile Selassie was silenced, including the dark time. So once Haile Selassie was killed, the destruction of this feudal order was top priority for the semi-socialist or whatever military rule that then turned into the Workers' Party. So the complete eradication of this was an enormously important aspect of it. The renegotiation of Ethiopian nationhood, in a way. And this was taken on by the EPRDF with ethnic federalism. Regionalism became much more important. Now it's all about unity in diversity discourses that have sort of guided this. There's no mention of Haile Selassie. It was even sometimes it feels like we are in a time now where more research on Haile Selassie is coming back up, and more public interest in Haile Selassie is there and allowed than it has been in many years before. That's what I see at the moment. For example, I had this conversation with a colleague of mine, and she said, look, guys, what you're doing with Haile Selassie and his modernizers in this exhibition on Ethiopian abolitionists, which focuses very much on Rastafari before his Haile Selassie and this sort of political reckoning, intellectual reckoning of this 1920s to 1930s, roughly. She said, I'm not exactly sure that you could have done that so easily 30 years ago, you know.
Okay. So I guess, and this is kind of off the cuff a little bit, but you said that it's still a very important part of the Ethiopian, you know, I guess you could say foundation, for lack of a better word. But does that myth of King Solomon and Queen Sheba, does that in some way, from a spiritual myth standpoint, connect Ethiopia to Israel?
Well, it's in a way it does. You know, there is the Ethiopian diaspora very early, the ecclesiastical diaspora in Israel in the medieval times. There is connection in this sort of realm. The Coptic Church, also together with the Catholics, Ethiopia had an enormously singular standpoint in the rest of Africa. There is this myth of Prester John, you know, this idea of the African king that sits on a tremendous amount of golds. Ethiopia being part of a Christian culture was enormously important in the way Ethiopia was perceived for centuries, and it is still now. It's just that now we're also dealing with so many political processes, and then there is the whole famine imaginations and all this sort of images that we have given to Ethiopia. But depending on where we look in time, Ethiopia was a very, very special place based on this history of Christianity.
So
Absolutely.
with that in mind, how common was it for Ethiopian slaves to be exported or used for trade with other African nations?
Well, so there is obviously evidence in the name Habash, Abash, Alabash, Abashi, which runs in the Indian Ocean, Arab, Red Sea areas, which designates people from the Horn of Africa inland mainly. So there are, but this is a blanket term, so you never exactly know where you are. I mean, this is really difficult to then pinpoint an exact location of people. But Ethiopian slaves played an enormous role in the Indian Ocean areas, in the Red Sea areas, in Arabia. Slaves from Ethiopia were traded to the Ottoman Empire. They were in Egypt. Again, depending on the time, eunuchs from Ethiopia became massively influential in Islamic courts in Saudi Arabia. There is this story of, that's now not an African kingdom and neither is Saudi Arabia, but there is the story of Malik Amba, who is a Gujarati sultan, and he is from slave descent, and one of the books about his life say he's potentially from Kambata. Another account says he's from Hara, which is east, and then Kambata would be southern Ethiopia. So depending on the time, Ethiopian slaves played a role as silent commodities and sort of come to life through accounts, through stories. Then when this whole exploration of the Horn of Africa begins, many of the travelers, missionaries, they were hugely dependent on manumitted or liberated slaves, or even bought slaves themselves. They were informants because they had come from very different parts of the country where the Europeans had not yet been able to go. So a lot of stories that are being taken word to mouth from the mouth of former slaves, who tell them, okay, there down there's this, here's that, there's this. These
Right.
people are called that. Then you cross this river, and then you end up with this people. And I was a farmer here, and our king was that. And then my father sent me to herd the goats, and then I was kidnapped by the so and so. And all these stories exist, right? I mean, so slave voices, while often sort of overshadowed by larger political contexts, are hugely informative when you find them, when you read against the grain, maybe a little bit.
Right. And you know,
so
what's
this,
interesting about that is that, you know, when you think about, like you said, there were a period of time where the majority of the population in these African areas, well, first of all, Ethiopia is probably a lot bigger than most people might imagine. You know what I mean? It's not necessarily a small landmass. And then you have the Western influence in terms of changing the names, where, you know, Abyssinia may have been the name that it was referred to by the native tongue, but then, you know, through missionaries or whatever, it became known as even Africa or Ethiopia. You know, there's even an argument that at one point in time, all of Africa south of Egypt was considered Ethiopia because it just meant burnt face, you know, all the way to the Congo. I've heard this particular argument too. So when you think about Ethiopia in terms of the transatlantic slave trade, you know, and what was going, I lost my train of thought a little bit because I had a very specific question that I wanted to ask you regarding that. But is it possible that what is the probability that slaves in the transatlantic slave trade were taken from the shores of other places, but that they originated in Ethiopia? So was there a migration of Africans out of Ethiopia that could have lent to the population of the slave trade, say in the West or in other parts of Africa?
Also, so there are a few things here. One is Ethiopian slaves become are many in Europe in missionary societies. Europe, that I don't know, Sudan Interior Mission and so forth, that comes very late. But so we are talking, for example, the Swedish mission, the St.